what I've chosen is to look at this issue of governance and service delivery through the lens of community protests. I'm doing that because I think these protests give us a certain set of insights that will be particularly valuable for the broader debate that is the subject of this roundtable. And I know this isn't such a large screen, so you may miss some of the detail. And I think we are making copies available. Yeah. And I'll point out the relevant details anyway. So don't try and furiously take notes. We're privileged in South Africa to have a number of outfits and academic institutions that are tracking these protests. And I've mentioned 3 up here: Municipal IQ, the UWC Community Law Center team, and the UJ Social Change Research Unit. They all use slightly differing methodologies, but they tell basically the same story, which is that community protests have escalated starting in 2004 with a number, and then in 2009, it doesn't matter who you look at, there's a peak, well over 100 according to the Municipal IQ database, 314 according to UJ. So there's a peak in these protests in 2009, and then another peak in 2012. We have one plateau there, and we seem to have risen, and we're now on another plateau in terms of these protests. So there's undoubtedly a phenomenon. It is widespread. It's happening across all of our provinces. I'm not sure what's happened up here. There's those stats didn't come through very well. But you can see that they're happening predominantly Gauteng. This is meant to be Eastern Cape, Western Cape, KZN. And here's the UWC data. You can see these trend lines. Gauteng really, certainly in 2009, the bulk of the protests taking place there. Western Cape certainly coming up and passing Gauteng in 2012, although it's fallen back a little bit since then. So there's distribution of these protests across the entire country. But more interestingly, and I think this is where you're going to really struggle out, I've just pulled up the Gauteng protests, and we've put circles here on the location of all of these protests, and the size of the circle actually indicates the number. So you can see, particularly around Joburg, this clustering of protests on the periphery of the metro. Also a number taking place in Tshwane, also a Kuruleni. And this is what, you can see these form a sort of ring around, certainly around Joburg City, which has been referred to in some of the literature as a ring of fire. So this is the ring of fire that we're looking at. And I've given you 3 different plots. This is population density, and these black spots are informal settlements. And you can see that these are taking place in very densely populated areas, and a lot of them are informal settlements. And I've also plotted it against employment in Gauteng and economic activity. And the other feature here is that these places where the protests are taking place have very low jobs and very low levels of economic opportunity. And what this map really does in one slide, it shows the characterization of these protests. They're taking place in dense informal settlements on the periphery of our cities, with high unemployment, low economic opportunities, and a high level of deprivation, particularly relative to nearby areas. So there's very pronounced, I mean, there's a high degree of inequality, but there's also very visible inequality in terms of these places. One of the things these databases track is also what the stated reasons are for these service protests. Unfortunately, the municipal IQ data hasn't come through very well. I'm getting a funny thing saying category, name, and value. But what this slide shows you, this is the UJ data here. Service delivery as the most prominent reason given for these protests. Housing, water and sanitation, representation, so governance and accountability coming up, electricity, other issues, corruption, municipal administration, roads, unemployment. The municipal IQ data seems to suggest a far stronger focus on housing, services, land, and this is the UWC data. They actually quite usefully have gone for each year. Unfortunately, they don't have 2013 data publicly available, but for each year they've categorized the top 5 stated reasons for protests. And you can see land and housing, land and housing, land and housing, almost, very high up or at the top in terms of demands. Interestingly, electricity. I mean, we always like to speak about what the success story we've had in rolling out electricity. But electricity issues coming up very prominently. And then governance issues, corruption, nepotism, party political, ignored grievances. So that's what the databases are telling us. I want to take this line of inquiry and look now at Gauteng in particular. And I don't know if any of you have visited the GCRO website. It's a fantastic website with GIS spatial data, and they do the survey every couple of years, which tracks public perceptions around service delivery as well as people's quality of life. And they use a composite set of indicators. This is their quality of life indicator. It's from 2011. It's the latest that they're about to publish now, I think, the 2013 data. But it's not publicly available yet. So this is a quality of life indicator. They use 56 variables, including security, basic services, health, participation, employment. And just what stands out is 2 areas in Gauteng which have got extremely low levels of quality of life. Western area, and particularly this cluster of wards in Western area, which is where the service delivery protests last year were taking place very, very prominently. And then this northeastern section of Tshwane, which sort of runs along the Moloto Road, and it's the former Metsweding area that was incorporated into Tshwane, that I'm sure a lot of you will remember there were some very prominent protests around the incorporation of Metsweding. So, already in 2011 we had 2 areas which were standing out and shouting at us as areas of high degrees of problems. And a year or 2 years later, we predictably have a set of service delivery protests. This is the same GCRO data. This is just looking at quality, satisfaction with municipal services. And I've looked at water, sanitation, roads, and waste by municipality now. And you won't see it, but the prominent thing is Western area, which is the second last bar in each one of these. And you can see that Western area, this is very dissatisfied and dissatisfied. Very high proportion of people dissatisfied or extremely dissatisfied with water, with sanitation, with waste in particular, roads even higher. So again, data from 2011 telling us a story, and that's a similar data mapped. So it's a composite indicator, satisfaction with government services. And again, these wards in Western area where the protests took place standing out, and the former Metsweding area. Quite a few people have written about this, and I'm just going to review some of the analysis. There's a group. We've actually lucky to have Trevor Ngwani here with us, so he can actually tell you his views more accurately than I can. But to summarize crudely, I'm sure I'll get it wrong, the line that this UJ team has been taking is that these are not just about service delivery. In fact, they're also a comment on the quality of post-apartheid democracy. Many of these people are unemployed who aren't able to protest by going on strike because there's nothing to strike against, and they're finding alternative channels for their grievances. They are the culmination of a long process of formal claim making. They're not a small minority, and they come from largely formal townships, which is slightly different to the data I showed you earlier. They talk about the democratic processes behind these protests and call for fundamental economic and institutional change. There's another paper written by Conrad Larumo published in Umsebenzi this year. He argues that service delivery protests are a complete misnomer. In fact, these are not protests about the lack of services, but in fact more often than not are the result of development coming into communities and contests around that development. So they struggles over the control of the benefits of development. They struggles to deepen participation in development. Struggles for economic participation and decent livelihoods, and struggles to enhance accountability and responsiveness of the state. And he argues that many of the prime movers are in fact from within the broad ANC family or the alliance, people that have lost political power and are seeking to regain influence through other channels, and that the unemployed youth are then the main force, particularly where instances of these protests turning violent. I've mapped this trend line. I'm just, you can't see the thing here. These are economic indicators, which... Okay, very good. And I just wanted to show you GDP growth, interest rates, exchange rate, consumer confidence, and unemployment. The one big thing to notice is that this peak in 2009 coincides, of course, with the start of the global economic recession, but also very prominently in terms of South Africa's own circumstances. It corresponds with a major economic downturn. Loss of consumer confidence, interest rates going up, exchange rate going down, and GDP growth plummeting. And I've also just given you a timeline for South African events. And I suppose the most obvious ones to note: local government elections in 2006, Polokwane Conference in 2008, international crisis 2009, plus the general elections, World Cup 2010, local government elections, Mangon conference, and then of course Madiba's passing in 2013. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about the link between these protests and elections. In fact, some of the commentators have said that these protests tend to peak before elections. In fact, the UJ data, which I've given you 2009 and 2011 here, shows that the peak is in fact after elections. There the peak is in May, not April 2011. And here the peak is in fact in July, 2 months. And this seems to reinforce another commentator. In fact, it's a team of people led by Carl van Holt, working for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And Carl talks about, they've minutely researched these protests in communities, and they talk about the way that, similar to Comrade Laruma, these reflect internal struggles over resources. They're focused on ANC councils as the nexus of power, status, and resources. And they're a local reflection of bigger battles taking place within the ANC. Just trying to then summarize and pull these things together, there seems to be a certain anatomy to this. There's a set of underlying grievances, services, corruption, jobs, even demarcation issues. There's a set of triggers, which typically is an unresponsive and seemingly uncaring administration that ignores grievances. So there's failures of governance and accountability, and there's moments where these issues intersect with divisions, particularly within the broad ANC alliance. And then there are ways that these things escalate. And one of the prominent things has been the way that security forces come in and slightly over-respond or respond inappropriately, and that seems to inflame the situation.
Okay, your 2 minutes are up.
Okay, this is the last slide and then the questions. I've listed some risk factors that I think we need to think about and take account of moving forward, and particularly when you're talking about how we respond to this. I think we need to be addressing some of the risk factors. And I've posed some questions. This is my last slide. My first question is, how do we characterize this? And I've given you a couple of different analyses. Are they legitimate responses to a genuine deterioration in service delivery and governance? Are they a rebellion of the poor against the systematic economic marginalization? Or are they a reflection of the ANC's internal struggles over resources